Welcome back to another exciting episode here at IT Pro TV. I'm your host, Wes Bryan. In today's episode, we're continuing through our VM series, and this is the VMware Certified Professional version 6. Joining me back in the studios again is none other than Mr. Don Pizzette. Don, how you doing, sir?
I'm doing great, Wes. Ready to jump in and wrap up the topic that we started last episode. We had jumped into installing ESXi, so you got a chance to see getting the hypervisor installed, which, in all honesty, probably wasn't the most exciting thing in the world, right? Because when it was done, we just saw that yellow screen sitting there doing nothing. So that was time for us to get our client installed on our desktop to be able to reach out and manage it and actually see that the thing is working and verify functionality. We stopped where we were downloading that client, but we hadn't actually installed it. So we're going to pick right back up from there and continue on so that we can actually see this thing in action. Because while installing ESXi is really simple, there are a few little steps that we probably need to go through before we turn it loose onto the world and throw it into production, right? So that's what we're going to take a look at right here, and we'll just pick back up with that install. Now, I was downloading it before the last show, and I finished that, but just to kind of recap how I even got to that, is that once the ESXi host was created, this guy right here, once it was installed, it gave us a little message, and it said, download tools to manage this host from, and it gave me the IPv4 and IPv6 addresses of this machine. So I could see it, I could take a web browser and browse to it and download the utilities. And on the actual client, when you browse to it, you see this web page right here, which is pretty straightforward. It's got download the vSphere client from Windows, which is what I started downloading at the end of the last episode. All right. Now there are other things on here like the virtual appliance for vSphere remote command line and VMware vCenter and other ways to manage it. We're going to see those in other episodes. But for right now, I want to focus on the vSphere client for Windows. Now, quick little note, this is the vSphere client for Windows, not for Mac, not for Linux. They just have it for Windows, right? There is a web-based client that we'll see that can work on some other platforms, but for the most part, VMware does expect us to manage vSphere from a Windows client. So you'll want to have a Windows client tucked away somewhere. I'm on a Windows 10 machine here, so I downloaded that file right at the end of the last episode, so that was downloading, and here it is. Now we're just going to run through and do the install. Now the install itself is pretty straightforward, right? We're just going to run through. There's not really any crazy prerequisites for the client. It does require some .NET framework stuff and a few other things, but it's built in a way that it'll actually reach out and download it if it's missing. So we don't have to jump through a bunch of hoops. It used to be super annoying that in order to use the web portal, you had to have Adobe Flash installed, or you had to go and get Java, you had to have prerequisites. Now it's really just click and run, which makes our life a lot easier. Now, once it actually runs and gets installed, then we'll just need to point it at our ESX box and we'll be able to manage and control it. So I need to pick my language. Let me just get rid of all this stuff in the background here. So I need to pick my language. I'll stick with English since that's the one that I have minor mastery of. And it'll kick into the install. And you'll see there's not a whole lot of amazement going on here. Simple wizard. We're going to click next a handful of times. We'll agree to our license agreement like we're used to. And we'll pick a folder to install it in. Now, if you look at that path, c:/program file /x86 /VMware /infrastructure, right? First off, it is a 32-bit client, so we don't have to have a 64-bit desktop. We can have a 32-bit, that'll be fine. And then they call it VMware infrastructure, because this used to all be called the VI suite before they renamed it to vSphere, and they just haven't changed the path name for that, but we don't necessarily care about that. So we can go ahead and hit next and perform our installation. And you'll see right off the bat that I'm missing the Visual C++ 2008 redistributable runtime, so it's reaching out and downloading it. And so it'll get anything that we're missing. There's the Visual J# runtime or whatever it is that it needs, it'll grab, and then it'll finish the install. When it's done, I'll have a nice little icon right here on my desk for the vSphere client. Now, be aware that this client is designed to be a standalone application that can run right here from this workstation and then connect to any ESXi box that I need to manage. When we deploy vCenter in the vCenter episode, it actually has two different clients. It has an application-based client that you run right from your desktop, and it's got the web client that actually runs from the vCenter server. Now, in vCenter, the web client is fully featured. It's got every option that you need. The native client that runs on your desktop is actually missing a ton of options. It's very lightweight. So when it comes to working with vCenter, you almost always want to use the web client. But if you're not using vCenter, if you're just directly connecting to the ESXi box, then you'll want to use this native client right here. And it just finished installing. So now it's done. That didn't take very long, right? And once it's done, we finish up, and there's the icon on my desktop that I mentioned, the VMware vSphere client. It's just sitting right there. The web client that we'll see with vCenter, it'll actually say VMware vSphere web client as the file name, so you'll know which one it is. So I'm going to go ahead and fire that up, and we'll get launched into it. Now, you can connect to as many different ESXi boxes as you want, one at a time, all right? This client, it's not tied to a particular machine, and you'll notice that even though my ESX box was ESXi 6.0, that it's got the vSphere 5.5 and beyond support. So I can actually manage 5.5 boxes as well as 6 boxes, so you can punch that in right here. It doesn't have to be the client you downloaded it from. In other words, I don't have to download this over and over again from each ESX box that I've got. I can punch in the IP address or DNS name of the ESXi box, and if you don't remember it, you can just jump back to the screen, and it's printed right on there, right? So I'm 192.168.0.156, and so that's what I'm punching in here in the box. Now, during the install, it had me pick a password. It didn't have me pick a username, and that's because the default username is root. And so I'm going to punch in root for that username, and then I'll punch in the password. So I picked the word password, all lowercase, not very secure, but that's what I picked. Now, you do have the option to use Windows session credentials. That's not going to work here because it's a brand new box. We just brought it online. But we're going to talk in a later episode about single sign-on, or SSO. And when you have vCenter deployed and you've got the Platform Services Controller, the PSC in place, you can integrate with things like the Microsoft Active Directory. And if you do that, you can give Windows users permission to control ESX boxes or vCenter itself. And that way, when they log in, they can just log in with their Windows credentials. Now they don't have to provide a username and password every time they connect because they already have logged in just by logging into their workstation. Really makes life easy. You don't want your network admins to all have 2 different accounts. One account for VMware, one account for Windows. It'd be nice if it was shared. There's a few reasons for that. The main reason being, if you have people with multiple accounts, they end up sharing them. If I say, I need Wes to do something in VMware, here's my VMware login. I'll give it to him because I know he can't get into my email. It's a different account. But if it's all one account, I'm not going to give that to Wes. I'm going to keep it to myself. So we need to just be aware of that single sign-on really helps, but it does take a bit of a setup on it. And we'll have a whole episode on single sign-on later on. But because this is a new install, even if I wanted single sign-on, it's not configured. And so I've got to log in with that account that we created during the setup. So I'll choose that, and I'll hit login. There we go. All right, now, when the server was installed, it created a self-signed certificate. So I'm going to get a warning about that, saying, hey, there's an SSL certificate on this thing. We can encrypt. It is a valid certificate, except it was issued by localhost.localdomain. We don't know who that is. So are you sure you want to trust it? Well, because this is a new box, we don't really have a choice here, right? It generated its own certificate. We can replace it later on. The PSC, or Platform Services Controller, has a whole certificate management service in it. And so once we're connected to vCenter, we can repopulate all of our certificates and know that they're trustworthy. But because this is a new box, all I can do is view the certificate and take a look at what's in there to see whether or not it matches what I think it should match. So for example, the valid from date should match the date that I installed the server, right? I installed that server yesterday, May 23rd, 2016, and so that's the date that I expect to see here. If I see a different date, then I might have connected to somebody else's ESX box. You can also look in the details and find the fingerprint for the certificate. It's buried in here somewhere, or thumbprint. I said fingerprint. You can find the thumbprint, and the thumbprint was actually displayed briefly during the install if we had written it down. I didn't bother to write it down, so now I can't even compare that. I could drop to a shell on the box, but we haven't enabled the shell function yet, so we're kind of limited there. So we really do just have to accept the certificate. All right, so I'm going to go ahead and choose to install the certificate so it won't display any warnings about it anymore just for now. We can always replace it later. All right, then I'm going to get a connection error. So the request failed because the remote server took too long, which is probably because I was rambling on about that certificate the whole time. So I'm just going to try and reconnect, and we'll give it another shot. So there we go. So it's reaching out to connect to that server, and there we go. I just talked too long. Now, when we installed the server, you might have noticed that it never asked about a license. It never had me put in a serial number or anything like that. And so when it comes up, it's going to come up in evaluation mode. And so it's warning me about that. My evaluation license will expire within 60 days. For those of you that are learning ESX, this is great because you can install as many ESX boxes as you want. You can run them for 2 months while you practice and learn, and you don't have to pay a dime. It's just an evaluation period. You don't even have to go to VMware site and register as long as you have the install files. And so you can install it and go. All right. Now it tells me that as soon as the evaluation license expires, all my virtual machines are going to stop. But I got 2 months, and if I'm just training or learning, this works fine. If, however, I'm going to be moving this into production, one of the first things I'm going to need to do is put a license key in here. Otherwise, all my VMs will just stop 2 months after we deploy it. So you put it in production, things are running great, and you're like, yeah, wonderful, I can kick back and relax. And then one day, all your VMs halt, and it's not a lot of fun.
All of a sudden, lights out.
Yeah, yep. And I've seen that. I've seen that with a number of different software products, not just VMware, where people forget the license, and that's how it runs. All right, so I'm just going to say OK to that, and now we get the actual vSphere client right here that we can start to work with. And it's not all that spectacular. You'll see most of my screen is empty space, and that's because I'm managing a single host, and I'm using the native ESX client, which is not fully featured, not like the web client we'll see when we connect to vCenter. So there's not a whole lot that we see here, but it's enough to get us set up for the server with what we want. And I've got a couple of different things that I always do on a new ESX box to get it set up. Just a few things that we might want to adjust even before we bring it into vCenter. Because once we bring it into vCenter, you'll manage everything from there. All the work will be done from vCenter. You'll probably never connect this way ever again after you get it connected to vCenter. And in fact, I didn't even have to connect the first time this way. I could have just gone straight into vCenter, but this is on the exam, so I wanted to make sure I showed it to you also. All right, so one of the first things we might want to do is attach that license key. Well, had I not cleared the screen, when that license pop-up occurred, it actually had a little link at the bottom where I could assign a license and go in and put it in there. But if you cleared it like me, we can still get to it. We're going to go into inventory up here. But when you look at this screen, let me explain what we're seeing. First off, it's kind of like a web browser. You get a little bar up here that tells you where you are right now. So I'm at home. I'm at the main page of this. And as I browse, we'll see this like a breadcrumb trail show me what I've navigated into. Then I can see I've got the inventory screen. And inventory is really important on vCenter. Here, inventory is just this one host. That's all I'm connected to, so that's all I'm going to see. Beneath it, though, I've got administration. And here's where I can set up roles and system logs. This is kind of like setting permissions on the server. And then lastly, at the bottom, I've got the task status. Whenever you send a command, it actually sends the command and executes it on the server. And so you wait for a status report back from the server where it tells you if it finished or not. So you can see things that are currently running. When you hit OK on a box up here in the native client, that setting doesn't take effect right away. You've got to watch down here to see for when that status changes to completed, and then it's taken effect on the server. So those are kind of the three elements that I'm seeing on the screen. And I'm going to go into inventory. And when I go into inventory, now I'm seeing the really important stuff. I see my server right here, 192.168.0.156, and I could add more servers to connect to and so on, but you can really only be connected to one at a time. And then when I look at that server, I can see the summary, the virtual machines, resource allocation, performance data, and so on, all listed out here. Now, some of it doesn't work without the proper license. A lot of it does work, so you can actually use the majority of the server's features even without a license right up until that 2-month mark. All right. But what I want is under configuration. And so as I look across these tabs, I'm going to find that configuration tab right there. And that's the configuration of the ESX box. And so you're going to see a bunch of settings here that pertain to the hardware of the box, and right beneath it, the software of the box. Now for hardware, there's not a whole lot we need to configure, at least for my system. If you had a SAN attached, you would need to go and configure the HBA, the host bus adapter, to connect to that SAN. If you had multiple network adapters, you might have to go in and configure the network adapters. You might bond some together or create a virtual switch, and we'll see those in later shows. But for me, I'm really just trying to do the bare minimum to get this thing drawn into vCenter to manage it. Technically, I've really got the bare minimum already, but some of the things I like to tweak are the licenses. So I went under the Configure tab, and right under Software, you'll see Licensed Features. And you can check on that, and this screen is going to update here in just a second to show me my licensed features. And I say it's going to do that anytime now, or it's just going to sit here. There we go. So now it's updated, and it's showing me the license I've got. And you'll see I've got an evaluation license. I installed it on May 23rd, so it's set to expire July 23rd. I've got 2 months that I can run. And during that time, I've got unlimited virtual SMP. I've got all these features, vMotion, X-Switch, vSphere HA. A lot of these are enterprise features. But I have every feature available to me on this evaluation license, at least for now. Okay. If I leave it this way, well, I have it for 2 months. But if I stretch this window just a little bit, there we go, we'll see the edit button. And that's where we can edit that license and we can fix it. So right now I show as no license. Down here I can say assign a new license key, and I can enter a key and punch in my license key. When you buy vSphere, or when you buy ESX by itself, like one of the foundation packs, then you actually get a license key. Even when you get a free copy from VMware, which happens more often than you think, they'll give you a key, and that's what is your actual item. You know, that's really the thing you're buying. So you punch that key in right here, and it'll update to reflect your key. Now, if you get a free one, or if you buy one of the cheaper ones from VMware, it'll usually have an expiration date on it. So your key might only be good for a year or 2 years or whatever, and then you have to renew. But if you buy the full ones, the expensive ones, they'll be unlimited. And so when you add that license in, it would show it right here and say that it was unlimited or whatever. And I would love to show that to you guys on the show, but it actually puts the key right there on the screen no matter what you do. Even after you enter it, the key is right there, so I can't do it without showing you one of the keys. But once you punch it in, it'll show that key, it'll show what you're licensed for, so what feature set, and it'll show when it expires. If it says no license key, you're in the eval mode, and it's just a matter of time. But if you look down here, you'll see all the things that it'll display, the product, capacity, how many of them you have available, because you might have purchased a pack of keys, and so you have more than one, and when it expires. All right, so that's one of the things that we'll definitely want to punch in is our license keys, so that we make sure our system doesn't shut down on us a few months from now. That would not be fun. All right. After that, there's a few other like loose ends that we need to get kind of tweaked on this stuff that are somewhat optional. DNS. When we did the setup on this, we ran through the setup, and the network adapter for it, at least the management adapter, was set for DHCP. So I'm getting a dynamic address. Well, I might want to change that address. Even with dynamic addresses, though, it might not have gotten DHCP, or DNS servers. So it might not be doing name lookup properly. So configuring the network adapter and configuring name lookup are two things that are kind of important. And so what you'll see is when you look over here, it's actually in two different places. So when I look at the configuration, we've got hardware up at the top section, and you'll see processors, memory storage, and networking. All right. And when you go to networking over here, you'll see not your physical adapters, but your virtual switches. And we'll talk about virtual switches later on. But right now, what you have is a management network bound to the one network adapter that I had. If I had more than one network adapter, they would show up here. If we go down to network adapters, now we see the physical adapters. Okay, so I can see VMNIC1 and VMNIC0, the two network adapters that I've got. One is attached to a vSwitch already, so it's ready to go. The other one is not attached to anything. It's just sitting there doing nothing. But I can see those adapters, and not all that much I can do with them right here, right? But I can see if they have an IP address. We'll see IP ranges that have been spotted on the adapter and so on. That's all going to kind of show up right in here. But then if we scroll down to the software side, under software, this is where we're going to see DNS and routing. And that's what I'm really after. If I want to check my DNS servers, if I want to check my default gateway, DNS and routing is where I want to be. And so when you go under DNS and routing, you'll see, for example, I've got a preferred DNS server, right? I don't have any alternates. This is probably something I learned from DHCP, since it says DHCP right there. But I can override that if I want. You may need to put in your particular DNS servers to make sure this thing can do resolution. It's also got the host identification. Right now I'm just called localhost. So I might want to change that, right? Something that's a little more meaningful, and so we can set that by going into our properties and adjusting those settings. Okay, now it's actually not going to let me change the host name right here. We have another place where we can change it, and it's usually better to bring it into vCenter and change it in vCenter. That way it's updated in that database too, so I'm not too worried about that. But after it, we've got obtain DNS server address automatically, and we can change that to different adapters that we've got created, or we can manually specify it. And so I might want to override that. And let's say I just want to use Google's, right? So I could come in and punch in Google's DNS servers. I can override my host domain lookup suffix. which I'll make it lab.itpro.tv, so we can get that set and kind of tweak those settings. You'll also see where we can jump over to routing, and here's where I can set my default gateway. And I'll leave the default gateway alone, but if you needed to override that value, you've got it right there too. So now that I've got those set, it's warning me about IPv6. Right now I've got a static IPv6 address, but it's a link local, which is not an address that I can really use for anything beyond local communication. So it's just warning me about that. I'm going to go ahead and just ignore it. We also have to be careful. If you change the settings here and maybe you're connecting from another network, you could put a bad gateway in there and lock yourself out of the machine. So you always want to be careful with that when you configure networking settings. But since this is a brand new server, I'm not too terribly worried about it. If this was an existing server, I'd be a little more concerned. All right, so let's see. That's DNS. We talked about the license. Time. Time is one that we overlook a lot. When you install ESX on a server, it's very possible that the clock on the motherboard of your server is wrong. And we might not care about that. Who cares, right? I'm going to bring up VMs. The VMs will have their own times in them. What do I care what time the host thinks it is? But there's two main reasons we need that time to be right on the hosts. The first reason is log files. Anytime an error occurs or some other thing happens, there's a timestamp. And if the clock is wrong, the timestamp is wrong. And now we don't actually know when the error occurred, especially if we're comparing it with other servers. I might have a failure happen in a VM, and I can't correlate that with the failure in the host to see if it was related to the host. So I need the time to be right, if for nothing else than the log files. The second thing is, if we're doing single sign-on, and you've got things like Kerberos authentication, they are tied to a timestamp. And if the time is incorrect enough, then you're going to have a problem. You're going to have a problem where you won't be able to authenticate. And the most common one that I see is you bring up a server, and like we're in the Eastern time zone here. So let's say you bring up a server that's in the Pacific time zone. That's a 3-hour difference. So it might be 10 o'clock here, but the server boots up and it shows as 7 o'clock. So what do? Well, if you fix the time zone, the server will show as 10 o'clock. But you could just take the clock and move it to 10 a.m., right? Now it's 3 hours ahead of where it should be. And because it's 3 hours ahead, every Kerberos authentication packet you send has a timestamp that exceeds 5 minutes, and that's going to show as a replay attack, and it's going to block it and you won't be able to authenticate. So having the correct time on your servers is really important. And not just having the correct time on one server, but having it correct everywhere, having all of your servers synchronized. So setting a time server is pretty important. And that's right above DNS and routing in my settings. I've got time configuration right there. And we can come in and we can set what we want that time to be. Now, mine's got the right date. It is May 24th, but it's showing that it's 1:08 a.m. And if I look at my watch, it is 10:24 a.m. So my clock is wrong, okay? Why is it wrong? Well, I might be in the wrong time zone, but here it's even worse because I'm showing 10:24. This shows as 1:08. That's off by like 16 minutes. That's good math right there. So that's off by 16 minutes. That's not a time zone. I'm not aware of any time zones that are at a 16-minute offset. So I need to fix my clock. And it used to be that you had to SSH into the box and do all these command line stuff to do it. I put the command line stuff in the show notes if you want to see it. But in ESXi 6, we can just do it all from right here. I can pull up the properties and I can fix that time. Okay. So in my case, I need this to be 10 o'clock. And it's 10:24, like that. Now, I can set it by hand, but how accurate am I going to be? When I look at my watch, it says 10:25 now. I don't know how many seconds. Well, Kerberos allows for a couple of minutes to be off, and that's okay. So I just have to be close. But it's even better to use an NTP server. If you use an NTP server, now you can synchronize time with an external host, and you have all of your servers synchronized time, and now you're in better shape. And now it'll take care of things. If you ever have your time zone wrong, you'll still have to deal with that. But at least your clock will be right, and your clock will be synchronized amongst all your machines. So you can go into your options, and you can specify who you want your NTP server to be. So I could add one in, like pool.ntp.org, or whoever it is that I want to use. Maybe you want to use the Naval Observatory or somebody, you can punch them in. And then, whoops. Then we have to turn it on. So this is something that a lot of people miss, including myself right there, is that I added pool.ntp.org. And see how it's got this restart NTP service to apply changes? If it was already running, I would need to do that. But the reality is it's not running. If I go under general, see how it's got start and stop manually? And the start button is lit. So it's not even running. I'm going to choose start and stop with host. So every time the host boots up, start the NTP client. And when you shut it down, go ahead and stop the NTP client. So it's tied to the host. That's normally what we want. All right, so I'm going to choose that, and I'll start it. So now that it's up, I'm going to start synchronizing my clock with pool.ntp.org or whoever it is that you choose. So now I don't have to worry about getting the seconds right on this. It's going to synchronize, and we'll have a correct time on our host. All right, so that'll take care of that. And so now I can see that update right there. I'm set to synchronize with the time server, and I'm in business. You're probably doing this already with a lot of your gear, your routers, your switches. You probably have them synchronizing. This is just one more. If you have a Windows Active Directory, you can synchronize against any of your domain controllers, and that's a great thing to do, in my opinion, is set up a domain controller to be your local time source and have all of your devices sync off of it. That way you control your own time. If you use external time servers, there's always a risk that somebody could come in with an NTP attack and try and override that and start to kind of wreak some havoc on your network. So setting up your own internal time sources is a pretty useful thing. All right, what else? I think the only other thing I have is, SSH. SSH. So I've been using the GUI up to this point, and that's because I'm just doing the bare minimum, and then we're going to add it to vCenter anyway. We'll do everything from vCenter. But from time to time, you might need shell access to your server. And shell access to the server is disabled by default. I can't get to the terminal by default. So if I want that, I need to turn it on. And we can turn it on pretty easily in our security settings. So let me get to that. So to get to it, I'm under configuration, right? So I chose my host over here, and I went to the configuration tab. And then under configuration, if you look in here under software, you'll see security profile. Now, in the future, we'll manage, going crazy here. We'll manage our security profiles from vCenter. That's where you want to have a centralized security profile. But I don't have vCenter right now. So for right now, I'm going to have to manage it myself. And if you look at the security profile, you'll see things like the firewall. And if you just take a quick glance at this, I've heard this from a lot of people. If you look in here, you can find SSH. It's in here somewhere. I will find it. There it is, SSH server. And so on the firewall, it's saying allow incoming connections, and it's allowing SSH server, TCP port 22, from all. It's allowing SSH. So I should be able to SSH into this box, right? Not right. What it's doing is it's allowing all of the possible services that ESX can run. So it's vSphere stuff, right? So like vSphere Web Access, that's how I downloaded the client in the first place. But there's other things like SSH that it's open on the firewall, but the service isn't running. It's not actually running to connect with. VMware turns all this stuff off, and then you have to turn it on if you want it on. Things like SNMP server. It's got it open on the firewall, but the service is not running. We've got to configure it, give it a community name and all that stuff before it actually runs. That's up to us to set it up. They don't want to turn that on our behalf. But it's also nice that we don't have to mess around with the firewall. They've already opened those ports. So what I need to do is I need to scroll up here to the top where I've got services. And here I can look at all the services that are on the system, including SSH right there. But this screen doesn't tell me if they're running or not. I just see them. I need to go into properties, and now I'm looking at the profile, and now I can see, like there's SNMP server, stopped. It's installed, it's just not running. And you can see what is running. Load-based teaming daemon. That's so that I can bond network adapters and do teaming across them. So it's running even though I haven't bonded anything yet. Or the NTP daemon, I had to start that. That wasn't running earlier. I started it when we set up the time server, right? So I can see that it is running. Syslog is running. That's kind of important, right? We need our logs. SSH is stopped. It's not running. So I need to start that thing up. And if you just highlight SSH and hit options, so the options button way down there, in the options, it's just like the time server. I can say start and stop with host, or I can just start it manually. Maybe I just need to use SSH for a little while. So I can start it now, connect, do my thing, and then come and stop it again. Maybe I don't want that attack surface, right? We'll see the firewall in another episode, and what's better is you can turn on SSH and leave it running, and then go in the firewall and list IP addresses that are allowed to connect. Don't just allow everybody to connect. Say, I need my workstation and maybe some of the other network admins. I want them to be able to SSH, and that's it. So that gives us that extra level of security. You can leave SSH on all the time. I'm going to go ahead and start it up, though, and now I'm running SSH. It's still set to start and stop manually, though. I'm going to set it start and stop with the host, and I'll say OK. And I can verify it's running by looking right here. I see that it is now running, and I should be able to use it. All right, so let's test that out. I'm going to fire up PuTTY. You can use any SSH client. If you're on a Mac or a Linux box, they've got SSH built in. In the Windows world, we got to go out and get one. Eventually, Microsoft will wake up and package one. I don't know what's going on there, but I can punch in the server's IP address, and SSH uses TCP port 22, so I'll leave that as default, and I'll go ahead and open it up. And I get that certificate again, right? I haven't been able to validate that certificate, so I'll go ahead and say yes. And now it's going to prompt me to log in, and I'll log in with that root username and password that we set during the install. And now, here I am, okay? And it's telling me the time and date of this login have been sent to the system log, so it's recording that I've been here, and I can get VMware support if I need help with whatever damage I'm about to do to the server. And then after that, it's just telling me that I'm in the ESXi shell, and it can be disabled by an administrative user. We don't have to have SSH running, right? It wasn't running a minute ago, but now it is. So now that I'm in here, it's Linux, right? It's actually a modified version of SUSE Linux. And back in the day, it used to be Red Hat. Now it's SUSE Linux. And so you can dive around in here and look at stuff. It's not ideal to mess with stuff, but you can look at things. There are some settings they don't have a GUI element for, so you can drop to the shell and you can go in and find the config files and start to work with them. But you can do things like monitor. You can do. We can do like top. Nope, top's not there either. What are some of the examples of stuff that we can do? There we go, df-h. That'll show us our disk utilization. So I can look at my drives and what's being eaten up, how much space I have available or so on, so I can start to see that. So when I installed my operating system, how much space did it actually use? Well, it looks like I'm using about 972 megs on data store 1, which is technically an empty data store. I don't have any VMs created, so it's got placeholders in place that are eating that up. And we've got some other storage being used different places. We can navigate around and start to look at some of our config files and other information. And you'll see a lot of VMware proprietary stuff kind of tucked away in here. This is all part of the system. And typically, you're not going to want to jump in here and mess around. But there are times, there's actually a whole set of utilities. If I go into /usr/sbin and take a look around, you'll see that there's a lot of commands in here that are ESX, there we go, right here. This whole set. Let me just try and get these on the screen at once. There we go. So this whole little block on the left side, ESX-CFG, that's the ESX configuration tool. And so you'll see all sorts of different ones down here for doing configuration. You can configure your network cards, you can do scans, you can do SCSI device lists, and so on. All of this is for working with the ESX server. And that's what I wanted. I tried to run top earlier, and there's ESX top, which is specifically for it. I should have used that instead. So we can jump in and start to use these utilities. And now I can see performance utilization on my system. I'm only doing SSH, so that's why I was up there at the top. But we can start to see what our system is up to and how the performance is running and all the different things that you might need to do from the shell. Not something we're going to do every day, but something that we can turn on and you may want to do as one of the first configuration steps of getting your box turned on.
All right, Don, thank you for showing us how to get the hypervisor going. Look forward to seeing some vCenter management in some upcoming episodes. It does look like we're coming to the end of another episode. Would you like to say any final words?
Did my server die?
It's dead.
Final words. So just a couple of things. You probably want to make some kind of a document for your work that says, every time I set up an ESXi box, these are the steps that I follow, like a template, right? And here it's up to me as a human being to do this. There's ways to make it where it's not up to me. So if you do host profiles in vCenter, somebody can connect the ESX box configured however they want, completely wrong if they want, and when it connects, the host profile will push down and get it all set right again. All right, so we'll learn about host profiles later. The other thing is you can use auto deploy, which we'll see in another episode also, to take hardware and automatically deploy ESX onto it pre-configured with everything that we need. So we don't have to do it by hand like this, but I wanted to make sure that we saw that, so if you get questions on the exam, you'll know about it because they expect you to know both ways. In real life, we have a lot of options.
Well, we appreciate all that great information, and we appreciate you, the viewer, signing out for IT Pro TV. I've been your host, Wes Bryan.
And I'm Don Pizzette.
And we'll see you next time.